right. Well, that was something. How's everybody doing today? It's Saturday, so that means that I'm not painting, I'm talking. I'm going to talk about art on these Saturday shows, and specifically on this one today because we are in the deepest point, basically halfway through the month almost, of ORKTOBER. Uh, so yeah, there we are. How's everybody doing? I'm doing pretty good. You can see I'm got the Saturday scruff going. It's quite bright in here because I've actually opened up the blinds and redid some lighting to try and make down here look better. Hopefully, as the sun is now moving across the sky, I now realize that I'm casting my light on my overhead is now not even. Such as when you set up the lights, an hour ago for this show, and you just kind of want to see what the outside world looks like. Even though my windows are absolutely filthy right now because of the construction and the sandblasting and whatever was going on out there, the outside of my windows is absolutely disgraceful. But that's the landlord's job to wash that, right? Not mine. So yeah, so what are we talking about on today's show? It is ORKTOBER, so we're going to talk about orcs. We're going to talk about orcs in art, orcs in. I don't want to get into like orcs and literary history and the origin of the orcs. From my recollection, from my vast amount of research I've done on the subject, the earliest mention of orcs in is probably from Beowulf, or probably something around that time. I know that Grendel was called an orc. He was described as being orcish. Orkneus, which roughly translates into monster, derived from Orcus, another name for Pluto, the Greek god of the dead. So that's from something I found on the internet. So take that for what it's worth. Apparently, the epic poem of 1516, Orlando Furioso, which I've never heard of until today. Poem by Italian scribe Ludovico Ariosto. The hero Rogero slays an orc while riding a hippogriff. And that's from 1516, so that's 16th century. So Beowulf is circa 1000-ish. Some people say it was written as far back as 800, or who knows, right? So that's sort of where orcs come from. And then obviously orcs, there's some derivation from orcs and goblins. Goblins being something very much from European mythology and folklore, and orcs being related to goblins. So when we get into the modern interpretation of orcs, I guess where we start is we'll start with Tolkien. So I'm going to see how this looks and see it's a little bit, you know what? I think the light is pretty good. The light's pretty even. So let's, and if you saw my Instagram, I have a giant pile of books that I'm going to go through, because that's what we do on these on these art shows, is we go through my collection of art books and other things. So let's start here with Tolkien. And I'll just sort of read you what David Day has to say about orcs. Orcs were those twisted form of life that Melkor spawned in the pits of Utumno. I don't know. For years they made up the bulk of his evil soldiery, and that of Sauron, the Dark Lord. Although orcs were the most numerous of the races that inhabited Middle-earth, they were more like beasts than elves or men. And so their tale is told with the other Kelvar in the natural history section. So I'm in the sociology section. So we can go to the natural history section and see what that has to say about orcs. The Nazgul. Here's an Olog-hai, who are kind of orcs. I think they're Olog-hai are. I'm not a Tolkien expert. I've read Lord of the Rings. Wow, there's a lot here on the orcs. I'm not going to read all of this, but here are the orcs of Autumno. Basically, the gist of it is that they used to be elves, so there's still essentially a form of elf. And if we go back to the slideshow, and I'll try and I can control the slideshow here a little bit, and we can get through. Ugh, some of this is just terrible. Okay, so here's probably my first. The first time I ever saw an orc. Trying to sort of recall in my distant memory where I first encountered orcs. And, excuse me, I'm just trying to organize my giant pile of books here. Where I first encountered orcs, and that would probably be the Lord of the Rings movie. And as you can see, these were orcs. So this was some rotoscope stuff that they shot for the film. And I was told that these were orcs. I was also told that these were orcs. And these are the orcs I kind of remember because I kind of have, obviously, my childhood brain would probably have an affinity towards the cartoon. And so to me, this was what orcs were for many years. And then I thought I would go, you need a Tolkien expert on the show. I do, Alex. Hey, Alex in the chat. I do need a Tolkien expert on the show. So one day you and I can sit down and you can tell me about Tolkien, because you actually are probably a lot more versed on the subject than I am. So I thought I would, in terms of what orcs would start to mean to me, this is my copy of the basic Dungeons & Dragons rulebook that I got for Christmas in 1981, I want to say. So this book was pretty instrumental, and I think I've talked about this on a previous show. This book is pretty instrumental in me becoming the sort of the person that I am today. And I went through this book looking for a picture of an orc, and there's no picture of an orc anywhere in the book. So I wouldn't have had. Here's basically the write-up for the orcs, and this is all in this basic book that covers the orcs. When I started playing second edition Dungeons & Dragons, the proper game in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, obviously there was more representation of orcs in there. And if we go back to our little slideshow here, and get through some of these, there are some Dungeons & Dragons orcs. And there's some Lord of the Rings orcs. I just sort of threw up some photos of orcs. Orcs throughout popular culture, and I will say that the less said about World of Warcraft orcs, the better. Again, I guess I need a World of Warcraft expert on the show, so you could be that too, Alex. You could be the World of Warcraft expert because I don't really know much about those, other than I don't really like them. This is Lord of the Rings. These are Rohirrim, obviously. Chopping down some orcs. And here we have a World of Warcraft orcs, which were, at the time when Warcraft, the first Warcraft game came out, they were pretty derivative of what Games Workshop was doing with orcs at the time, which would have been the time of, when was the first Warcraft game? You tell me, Alex. I remember it was mid-90s at some point, so we're probably looking at like 4th, 5th edition Fantasy Battle, 2nd edition 40k in terms of defining the look of the orc. But you look at this orc, and there's very much there's a heavy classical savage influence to this, and what they sort of became. Here we have some Warhammer orcs. I'm just not sure what I think of these. I almost want to call them like they're not westernized. They're almost easternized orcs, and I kind of, that's some of my criticism in general. Oh, don't even get me started on The Hobbit. But some of my criticism in general on what's happened in modern fantasy is the influence of, and it's sort of like it's like an echo effect, right? Like if you look at fantasy in Eastern culture, so you look at fantasy, the way that Japanese manga and anime views Western fantasy, so Tolkien, Western fantasy tropes, and then they throw that sort of their anime whatever kind of ideas behind it, and then that echoes back to us because we have a fascination with the Japanese anime culture and things like that. So that, and then that influences our Western fantasy. You're driving it on a 40-second delay. Yeah, that's all good. So yeah, so I don't really like. Well, I like some of the design aesthetics. I'm not really a huge fan of. I mean, of what Warcraft did with orcs. Yeah, I don't know. It's not my orc, but if it's your orc, that's cool too, I guess. It definitely, they definitely went with like this. I don't even know what that is. That's not an orc. But I saw this photo and I was like, is that from that movie, that Warcraft movie? And I remember seeing the Warcraft movie. I'm pretty sure I watched it on an airplane. So, and if anyone who's watched a movie on the airplane, you know how much of that you actually absorb watching it on the airplane. So I believe I watched the Warcraft movie on an airplane, and I don't really think I got it. But it had orcs in it, and they were kind of cool. There was some cool stuff with orcs, and there was some stuff with orcs where I was like, it's not really orky to me. And again, like, what is orky? And I don't want to get into a philosophy or a cultural discussion on whether or not orcs are some sort of a racist trope, because again, you're now attempting to apply contemporary morality to a very old concept, right? Very old concept of morality. When you start comparing moralities, it gets really confusing and really muddy, and I just don't think it. I don't think you achieve anything from it. You can become aware of, hey, you know what? Back then we had some pretty different ideas on what was the nature of good and evil, and what was right and what was wrong. We had very different ideas of what that was. And as we move forward, we've changed those ideas, and then you can slide back, but essentially we're moving forward on a lot of that stuff, and I don't want to get into it. I tried to have a discussion with someone about it, and I realized that he and I were arguing from very different perspectives. I was arguing from the perspective of someone who's just a fan of orcs, who just likes, goblins and monsters and creatures, and he was arguing from the perspective of someone looking at it through a critical lens. And I just said, okay, you know what? I don't think we're arguing the same thing. I don't think we're necessarily disagreeing, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think that we're arguing the same thing. I don't think we're going to get anything out of this discussion. I don't think either of us is going to change their opinion on the nature of good and evil, because they are a representation of that, and that's what Tolkien intended them to be. They were basically the living personification of war and destruction, right? I think Tolkien called his son was a fighter pilot in World War II, or a pilot of some type in World War II, and he called the airplane that his son flew in like a Nazgul riding beast. He says it's the equivalent of a Nazgul riding beast. So you can see where Tolkien was coming from it at, is he was trying to create something that was a personification of evil, and so it would have all those savage tendencies and that carelessness, and that lack of compassion and empathy. And I guess some other people may have used those same descriptors to deride racial and cultural things in the real world. So it's like saying, if I use the word bad to describe one thing, and then I use the word bad to describe another thing, but you don't think that other thing is bad, but I'm using the same word to describe it. I don't know, what are we arguing? What are we discussing here? So let's move on from that, because, again, as I was sort of doing a little bit of research today, because I did a bit of prep for this show, because I do know a lot about orcs, but again, I don't know everything about orcs, and this certainly isn't going to be an exhaustive episode on the nature of orcs, because we could go on and on and on. But in my sort of brief research this morning, getting ready for this, the amount of articles that I came across discussing essentially why orcs are problematic was astounding to me. and I couldn't believe that this was a discussion that we were having, and this was a discussion that people felt was needed or necessary, right? Like what orcs are elves exactly? Yeah. So what? But they're twisted, right? They're twisted elves. At least that's what Tolkien's orcs are. Um, Gollum was an orc, or sorry, Grendel was an orc. There are orcs mentioned, and obviously goblins. If we go by sort of the European mythology idea of goblins, we're dealing with something quite different. So these are some pig-nosed orcs. So again, let's see if I can find those others. So here's another Warcraft orc, and the reason I chose this particular picture is because these orcs here look so much like Warhammer orcs. And one of the funny things is that people will often say that, oh, well, GW copied orcs from Warcraft. Like, why because Warcraft was obviously a video game, which means it had a broader cultural appeal than, at the time, Warhammer, which was very niche and very esoteric. But if you played video games, you knew Warcraft because it was a huge game. And the orcs in Warcraft, you can't say that they're based on the Games Workshop orcs, but I mean, come on. Like, come on. So this guy, I don't know. He's, it was these two orcs in the background that really kind of did it for me, that made me throw this photo into the slideshow. And then here, this is from the Middle-earth role-playing game. Whoops, wrong shot. Let's go, there we go. So this is from the Middle-earth role-playing game. And here we have some very sort of classic orcs. And I don't know the artist of this. If anyone does, fantastic. Please let me know. And here we have from the Dungeons and Dragons movie. From the Dungeons and Dragons movie from 2000. The shitty Dungeons and Dragons movie from 2000. Which I remember watching and then immediately watching again because I couldn't believe what I had seen. I think I made my friends sit there and watch the movie twice with me because I was like, what? But again, at that time, Lord of the Rings had not come out yet. So what we had was Dungeons and Dragons. And then we got Lord of the Rings. So here are advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Liam Roche in the chat says, pretty sure Warcraft was originally designed to be a video game version of Warhammer, but the relationship between the companies broke down. I've heard that. I recall hearing that decades ago. I have no idea how true that is. It's entirely possible that Blizzard was working on a licensed game for Games Workshop using the Warhammer IP, and it became Warcraft. There's a lot of things in StarCraft that people point to as being very much 40k. Like the Protoss are basically Eldar. The Zerg are essentially Tyranids. The humans, what are they called? Space Marines? They're basically Space Marines. So who knows? Who knows how much truth there is to that, Liam? But yeah, I have heard that, and it's probably as believable as anything else. Oftentimes relationships will break down. I wouldn't think that they would start working on something until they had contracts signed, though. So there are things that make me think that it potentially is not true. But who knows? I do know that Andy Chambers left Games Workshop to go work at Blizzard, but that was years and years later, right? So there we go. So yeah, so these little pig-faced orcs are some of the early photos of. It's an early image of orcs that I remember. I think this is from the first Monster Manual. And then we have some. Well, here's some. You got to know this artist. If you don't know this artist, then I feel bad for you, son. This is Frank Frazetta. So this is some Frazetta orcs. And you can see that there's a real influence of the Frazetta orcs on the Ralph Bakshi orcs that would sort of show up in the Lord of the Rings movies. That sort of that rotoscope stuff, sort of that idea. And then obviously they're not orcs in the Fire and Ice movie, which is like the movie based on Frank Frazetta's work. But there are kind of orcs in it. They're kind of more like Neanderthal cavemen kind of things, but they're basically orcs. I mean, what are orcs, right? Frazetta likes the dark. He sure does. One of the things that I love about Black and White Frazetta is his absolute liberal use of thick black ink. He does love to do that really nice contrast, and it shows in this one little image. The amount of white space compared to the amount of black space is pretty cool. And I just like this bit of art, like these orcs on the march. And here we go. So this shot, I fucking hate. This is the worst thing to happen to orcs ever, is this. I don't know who the actor is. I don't know how much makeup they put him under. I'm just kidding. I know, it's CG. But it's those human eyes. It's those... they've made him very attractive. Like this is like Khal Drogo, you know, like... This is how you get romance novels with orcs as the main protagonist written, because people will look at this and people go, oh, I want to bang that. I guess, I don't know. I just hate it. I think it has something to do with the eyes, and it has something to do with the brow is not hard enough. The eyes are too soft. They're too human. Yes, Zarfalangle in the chat. Yeah, looks like the teeth are actually made from plastic. So I can see what they were trying to do. They were trying to make them look like translucent. Like if you hold an animal tusk or like a large tooth up to the light, it's actually a little bit translucent. Like there'll be a core to it. But yeah, everything about this, I just fucking hate. So on that note, let's look at some things that I like, because again, I put this stuff on the slideshow. Oh, look at this. So, whoops, another another bit of the Ralph Bakshi. So this is the rotoscope stuff, and this is literally dudes in masks being filmed, and then they rotoscope them. So Inquisitor Savax says looks too human, and that's just it, right? Like orcs are not humans, and at the end of the day, that's the argument, right? Is that they represent something within our mythology that should be alien and foreign to us because it's evil, right? So when we say orcs are bad, orcs are evil, we're saying don't be like orcs. You can get into you can go down a real rabbit hole on that one, but sorry, I'm just lost all my screens there for a second. So yeah, don't be evil. And there we have probably the best shot I was able to find of the orcs from the Dungeons and Dragons movie. So this is the orc that's sitting in the bar. I think it's at the beginning of the movie, because the movie starts like, you can tell the people who made the movie played Dungeons and Dragons and loved Dungeons and Dragons and kind of wanted to just throw in as much as they could. So obviously they have their movies start with a bar brawl, because how many of us have, played in campaigns, role-playing game campaigns that start in a tavern, right? And in classical tavern sense, there's all your species and all your races are represented. And this is not a bad orc. It's not a bad orc. I like the armor. I like the little helmet and whatever he's got going on his back here. It looks almost like a beetle shell. It's a cool design. I love the teeth, the rings, the eyes. It's certainly better than those Warcraft orcs. I'll give it that. It's a million times better than anything that's been done that was done in the Warcraft movie to deal with the orcs. So let's see what we got here next. And there we go. So now we're back to where there's a whip, there's a way. The little song that the cartoon orcs sing, and like I said, as far as I know, as far as I can recall, if I recall correctly, this is my first memory of orcs. The earliest. Not, well, these guys too, I guess, because it's from that same movie. And this is whoa. We'll get to that. So here we have some Dungeons and Dragons orcs, who have their own cosmology and their own thing. Yeah. See, now it's stuck in your head. You're gonna be singing it all day. Where there's a whip, there's a way. And I guess they're fighting who? What's his name? Drizzt. Forgotten Realms. Not my thing, man. Dungeons and Dragons. I loved Dark Suns. I thought Planescape was really cool. I could never get into the settings like Forgotten Realms or, I mean, Greyhawk was kind of cool but the Greyhawk was kind of like your classic. And now I think that like your default setting is the Forgotten Realms, because the old default setting for Dungeons and Dragons was sort of the concept of the 1,000 points of light. So you just live in a world. There's 1,000 points of light. Each one of these points of light is a kingdom and a civilization with its own culture and wada. And the space between it is whatever, right? It's jungle, it's forest, it's ruins, it's whatever. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my lumbar support there, so I got a little bit better on the back there. Ravenloft. I never played Ravenloft, but that was the horror setting. So again, at least it had a twist, right? What I didn't like about Forgotten Realms was that it just tried to be too generic. It went out of its way to be a generic fantasy setting, in my opinion, and it pulled a lot from the external influences, which is what Dungeons and Dragons was, right? Dungeons and Dragons was, we can't make Lord of the Rings the role-playing game because we don't have the rights from the Tolkien estate to do that. We can't make a role-playing game based on Conan because we don't have the rights to do that from the Howard estate. We can't make, anything dealing with any of the sort of the appendix. Was it Appendix 17 or whatever Gary Gygax essentially said was the influence to write Lord of the Rings. So Froffer and the Grey Mouser. So that stuff, the Lankmar series, and then obviously you go back and you're into things like Beowulf and Western mythology, European folklore and mythology, which is heavily influential of modern Appendix N. Thank you very much. I don't know why I said Appendix 17. Appendix 17 must be something else significant, but yeah, Appendix N, which has now sort of grown into its own genre. Appendix N is its own genre. Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is produced by Goodman Games, is probably the best exemplar of Appendix N essentially becoming its own genre, right? And I will buy a DCC book just because it's got that like classic art, that classic style, and that classic attitude of like 70s, early 80s Dungeons and Dragons, which is obviously dating myself, was when I sort of started to move into this and this became my thing. So let's get off this picture and find, there's the Whipmaster. And here we have Lurt. So the Lord of the Rings movies certainly gave us a cool perspective on orcs. I really liked the orcs in the Lord of the Rings films, for sure. This is a classic goblin here. By the time they got to the Hobbit films, I think they kind of lost it in the desire to make everything out of computers. You lose some of that hands-on creativity. It's why the Lord of the Rings films, as far as I'm concerned, are high cinema, and the Hobbit films are made for all the wrong reasons. And they could have, I think I've said it before here before that if you take all three of the Hobbit films, and I'm sure someone out there has done it, and I'm sure there's a version available somewhere on the internet. You take all three of those Hobbit films and you drop 80% of the shit in it, and you edit the rest together, and you'll end up with a decent 2-hour film, right? So it's funny because I'm sitting here talking at the camera, and then I realize you guys are just seeing a random black orc. An Uruk-hai, my fighting Uruk-hai. And this is a great photo. It's it's Ralph Bakshi, and in the background here you have a guy dressed as an orc, and I love it. And they would film these shots, and then they would take them into the animation studio, and they would rotoscope them. So, all right. So most here were probably born in the 70s, I imagine so. Oh, here comes someone who was born in the 12s. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Good. You know you're live on the internet right now, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. You know what I'm doing? You know what I'm talking about? Want to see what I'm talking about?
Boring stuff.
Boring stuff? I'm talking about orcs.
No, that's boring stuff.
That's boring stuff.
How many people are watching?
5.
Oh.
5 people are watching right now. You want to say something to those 5 people?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. Are you going back to finish your work? Make sure you close the door when you go, okay?
Why?
Because I don't want to hear the noise, and I don't want to have to get up and go close it. So when you go back...
You're just lazy.
I'm just lazy. I just don't want to get up and close the door. All right. Let's go overhead and look at this. So here we have one of my... I was sort of going through all my books, and I figured out that this is actually probably the oldest publication that I have. It actually predates Warhammer 3rd Edition, but I thought I would look at some orcs in
When
here.
were you? You used one of my sticky notes.
I used a whole bunch of your sticky notes. You can have them back when I'm done. You can always get more sticky notes. Yeah, you can see I use this blue sticky note right here. You know why I use this blue sticky note? Because I wanted to mark the page with the orc on it.
Fine, you can keep the sticky notes,
Right.
but you pay me.
I'll pay you for the sticky notes? All right. Yeah, I will make sure that you are reimbursed for all the sticky notes that I use. So do you want me to read this orc thing to you?
No, because I'm bored.
No, you're bored. Okay. You're really derailing this, you know?
What does that mean?
You're derailing this.
What does that mean?
It means that I was in the middle of talking about orcs, and now I'm just talking to you. So I'm not talking about orcs anymore.
That's a good thing.
That's a good thing that I'm not talking about orcs. But you like orcs. You like goblins. What do you like? You told me you liked something last night that it made me kind of go, ugh. What did you say you liked?
I forgot.
Unicorns? Did you say you liked unicorns?
No.
No, you don't like unicorns? What do you like?
I like elves.
You like elves? What kind of elves? Do you like evil elves, like dark elves, or do you like good elves, like
Dark
wood elves?
elves and the forest elves.
The wood elves?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Kaya one.
Oh, Kaya Stormborn?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's the mage
Yeah, and
in Scarlock's Elf Rangers. Okay.
And then I like the dancing ones.
You like the dancing elves? Oh, the war dancers. Yeah, war dancers are cool. But we're not talking about elves. We're talking about orcs.
Elves.
You want to talk about orcs?
Elves.
All right, so let's read about orcs.
Elves. 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 Elves.
Elves. There's no elves here. So there's
Elves.
ogres and orcs.
Elves. Elves.
Elves are all the way back here.
Elves.
I got nothing to say about elves today.
Elves. Elves. Elves.
You got a one-track mind, don't you?
Elves.
Go, you keep knocking stuff down. Are you on your lunch break? Is that why you're here, or what?
No.
No? What's going on?
I have, like, after this, like, I have this thing that mommy's getting my other class.
Right.
I have
You-
Saturday
So
school.
someone in the chat just told me to tell you that orcs are elves. Did you know that?
I don't believe
Orcs
that.
used to be elves.
I don't believe.
No, it's true.
Who is
I
it?
can. It's Inquisitor Savak in the chat. I can. Who's telling you that orcs are elves? Well, me. Orcs are elves. They were
No,
twisted.
who texted?
Oh, someone watching.
Do you know them?
I
What's
don't know.
happening here?
Those are my sound levels. So you can see when you talk. See how the green bar gets bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, and now. Okay. And see how it turns red.
Yeah.
Yeah, that means it's peaking. So you don't want to do that because that doesn't sound good. No.
Wah, wah, wah.
It's your show now. You want to talk about elves? Mm-hmm. So elves were twisted into orcs. So now we can talk about orcs. All the elves are now orcs now. Attention please, all elves are now orcs.
But they're still elves.
They're still elves? Okay. No, all orcs are elves, I guess. I don't know.
I'm going to keep daring.
So I don't know him. He says he doesn't know me. I found him via Ash. I'm in Seattle. Do you know where Seattle is?
The Big Apple.
No, so Seattle is south of Vancouver,
No,
so
Seattle's
it's on the
Big Apple.
No.
That's what Miranda says. The Big Apple.
See, I said Seattle is the Big Apple. I thought New York City was the Big Apple.
Seattle's the Big Apple.
Seattle's the Big Apple. There you go, Inquisitor Shavak. You live in the Big Apple.
Who
How's that feel?
Inquisitive Shavak?
He's the guy who's watching me right now.
It's the Big Apple.
And
That's
this guy
what
Liam,
Miranda
is
says.
he says hello from Australia, so he's in Australia.
Nani?
Okay. Make sure you close the door, please, sweetie. Close the door, please. All right, now we can get back on track here. So Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay doesn't really go into the orcs too much. Essentially, it just talks about their physiology, how they're big and they're tall. They're repulsive, they love to slaughter, they're cruel, they're always fighting. If they can't find people to fight, they'll fight each other. The whole of orc technology and culture is geared toward conflict. So these are Tolkien orcs, for sure. So this predates sort of any idea of a developing orc culture or orc story. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay sort of really laid the groundwork for what will become the Warhammer lore. And we'll toss that book away. And we'll pull out the next one, sort of going through publication dates. And I just pulled these out randomly, but we're going to end on a good one. So I thought I'd flip open to here. So this is the first sort of orc army list, and you can see the development of the orc aesthetic. You got your evil suns, you got your bad moons, you got your little angry ogre faces, the eye, which again is lifted very much from Tolkien. It's the Eye of Sauron, which is lifted from mythology, which is lifted from, anywhere else. Fun time, kids are great. We are the Emerald City. Yeah, I've been to Seattle. I've been to Seattle twice, both with the company I used to work for back in the early aughts. A little coffee company you may have heard of called Starbucks. I was a store manager there for several years, and they flew me out twice to Seattle for whatever. One was for training, and then one was for where they basically brought in every manager in North America, and we had a huge, big meeting at it was good times, whatever. So now we've done the Tolkien, done the Lord of the Rings, done Dungeons and Dragons. So let's get into... Where shall we start here? So there's two sort of distinct paths that we can go down. The first being Warhammer Armies. So this is 4th edition. So this was the Orc and Goblin Army book that came out at the beginning of 4th edition. It was the second army book released. I believe the High Elves was the first, and then Orcs and Goblins came out, and then they released Empire after that. And then after Empire, I want to say Skaven, Undead. Came out after Undead. Because Undead was Undead, and they then for 5th edition they did Vampire Counts on their own. But there was Skaven, Undead. Oh, Dwarves. Sorry, Dwarves came out before those. So the first 4 out were your core 4, I would say, which is High Elves, Orcs and Goblins, Dwarves, and Undead, and then Skaven, something like that. And I just sort of wanted to open up to some quick bit of work here. So this is some John Blanche. This is our boy Gorfang Rotgut and his boys, and most of these models were made into miniatures. So I wonder if he saw the Kev Adams sculpt and drew this, or if Kev Adams saw this and then sculpted the models. I have a feeling that it was Blanche looking at Kev Adams' orcs that he was sculpting and then he drew this. And there's a guy down here, and I wonder if they ever made a miniature for that and it was never released. A little shaman. So Liam says, what do you think were the people who most contributed to the GW Orc aesthetic? Well, obviously the Games Workshop design studio at the time of the mid '80s was the art studio was a real sort of just an amalgam. So you had Brian Ansell in there, giving art direction to people like John Blanche, people like Jess Goodwin, and Kev Adams. I think Kev Adams, you have to give a lot of credit for the modern interpretation of the orcs, but his stuff that he started to do, because I've read interviews with him when he came into the studio, guys like Jess Goodwin and Naismith, I think, were already sculpting orcs, and he sort of based his orcs on those. Now, obviously, as a artist evolves in their personal style, they make things their own. And I think that Kev Adams, more than any artist, made Orcs and Goblins his own. I mean, there's a reason we call him the Goblin Master. There's a reason why today he still gets, commission work. And I just backed a Kickstarter, Greenskin Wars. Go check it out. Nightmare Miniatures. This is, I think, their 4th or 5th one. The last one was the Greenskin Hunters. And then they did a Space Raiders one, which had some Space Orcs, which I've got some of the goblins from, the Gretchen. And so the new one is called Creatures Unleashed, and it's mostly squigs, but they're calling them Nashers, but they're squigs. And they're sculpted by Kev Adams, so he's still at it, right? He's still doing that stuff. So this here is where they really started to define the Orc and Goblin culture. And this book would last through 5th edition. The Orcs got no 5th edition book. They did get a 6th edition book, which is this one. And they got a 7th edition book, which is sitting over on the shelf, because I didn't really want to pull it down, because there wasn't too much. I just sort of wanted to sort of look at the difference in styles. To me, when I think 4th edition Warhammer, and I think 2nd edition 40K, because that's where those two games were at that point. The artist who, to me, defines the idea the most, you would think would be like John Blanche or something, but it's actually, to me, it's Mark Gibbons. And here's, right on the inside cover, we've got Skarsnik and Gobla, and this is a Mark Gibbons piece, and Mark Gibbons' work is throughout here. And the reason I sort of think about Mark Gibbons is because he only worked for Games Workshop during this time. Like Dave Gallagher, who did this cover, did... Get down to it. Did this cover, right? Same artist. So this is the 8th edition army book. So this is the last Orc and Goblin army book before they blew up the old world and killed Warhammer, and then created this, which we'll get to. But Mark Gibbons really only worked at Games Workshop did work for them during the time period of 4th edition fantasy. He may have done a bit of work from 5th edition, or at least he did work leading up to 5th edition. 5th edition is the color edition. But so when I think of sort of that era, I think of Mark Gibbons, because his work is throughout this book. There, another one, right? I love this piece. And when we get into sort of the 40K contemporary of this, which is this, and this has a Mark Gibbons cover on it, and again, it's little Mark Gibbons sketches peppered throughout. This is some John Blanche, and this is. So there's two distinct styles of John Blanche artwork to come out of this era. There's this stuff, which seems a lot like he spent a lot more time on it, plotted and planned. And then he has some work, because he was extremely prolific at the time. You have to understand that he was turning out an insane amount of work product at the time that these books were being produced. And so some of it is like this, which is a little bit more sketchy, a little a little bit more abstract in some ways. I still love it. I still, I mean, you can't fault an artist for going through periods and phases. And in the future, when I decide to delve in heavier into John Blanche, we'll get into that. Sort of my feelings on how his art style evolved and changed, and how I think that there's definitely a period where he was producing quantity over quality. And I would say that this era, mid 90s, this is what these are. So this is, I think both of these books came out. This book came out in 94, because I was working for Games Workshop when this book came out. And I want to say this book came out the previous year, so it would have been 93, because it was one of the first fourth edition Army books to come out. So, and at this time, and leading into third edition, which didn't come out until 1998. I think third edition was 98. Yeah. And third edition is where he really starts, like, you want to talk about quantity over quality. There's some of John Blanche's work that I think he would even have to admit should have never made it into those books. Not that it's not evocative, not that it's not good, not that it's not better than anything I could do. But again, it's an issue of he's producing a shit ton of artwork. And from what I understand at the time, he didn't, no, this is what I've heard from people who know, and I may be wrong, that he wasn't even working in the studio. He had a trailer in the parking lot where he would do all of his work, and he would go into the trailer and then emerge with stacks and stacks of these sketches that he would turn in, and the studio would accept and publish. I mean, like, these I think are great. They're not. There's a very distinct style to his work at this time. And I'll see if I can go through here and find something that I feel is less than his optimal output. I mean, I don't know. What do you guys think? I just bought some hassle-free Kev Adams orcs. Kev Adams make orcs for hassle-free? I have a bunch of hassle-free stuff, but it's mostly Kev White, his sculpts and stuff. Andy Chambers may have been part orc. I think we're all a little part orc. I think that's kind of, again, why maybe orcs appeal to us, is that because they, sorry, this dude just walked right by my window, which is odd. So Liam said, I love Mark Gibbons' work. Do you know if he ever released an art book? No, but I know that you can buy his artwork. I don't think he's ever released an art book because Games Workshop probably owns the publishing rights to a lot of that stuff. I don't, if he has released an art book, I would be surprised if there was a lot of his Games Workshop stuff in it. And I'm not really familiar with anything he's done before or after. To me, he encapsulates, and he is encapsulated within the Games Workshop, this era of stuff. Like, this is the Mark Gibbons little Blood Axe, little Storm Boy, and I love the little trail of smoke and stuff. And I know that a few years ago he put a lot of these up for sale. There we have a freebooter captain, Flash Get Badruck. So there's our Badruck, and I think on the next page, Mark Gibbons again. And there we have Gazco, another great thing. So I'm kind of jumping back and forth here. Not exactly how I planned to do this, but I didn't really have a plan. So I had about as much plan as John Blanche had in some of these sketches. I did want to kind of talk about the transition from this to this, though, because it changed the way that Games Workshop presented orcs in a big way. And the main result of that would be the change in sculptors. So here you have 90% of the models in here being sculpted by Kev Adams, with a few exceptions being the Perry twins, obviously the trolls. I believe these trolls are Trish Carden.